It was during the retreat of the 80,000, and the authority of the censorship is sufficient excuse for not being more explicit. But it was on the most awful day of that awful time, on the day when ruin and disaster came so near that their shadow fell over London far away, and without any certain news, the hearts of men failed within them, and grew faint, as if the agony of the army in the battlefield had entered into their souls. On this dreadful day, then, when 300,000 men in arms with all their artillery swelled like a flood against the little English company, there was one point above all other points in our battle line that was for a time in awful danger, not merely of defeat, but of utter annihilation. With the permission of the censorship and of the military expert, this corner may perhaps be described as a salient, and if this angle were crushed and broken, then the English force as a whole would be shattered. The Allied left would be turned, and Sedan would inevitably follow. All the morning the German guns had thundered and shrieked against this corner, and against the 1,000 or so of men who held it. The men joked at the shells and found funny names for them, and had bets about them, and greeted them with scraps of music hall songs. But the shells came on and burst, and tore good Englishmen limb from limb, and tore brother from brother. And as the heat of the day increased, so did the fury of that terrific cannonade. There was no help, it seemed. The English artillery was good, but there was not nearly enough of it. It was being steadily battered into scrap iron. There comes a moment in a storm at sea when people say to one another, "It is at its worst, it can blow no harder." And then there is a blast 10 times more fierce than any before it. So it was in these British trenches. There were no stouter hearts in the whole world than the hearts of these men. But even they were appalled as this 7 times heated hell of the German cannonade fell upon them and overwhelmed them and destroyed them. And at this very moment they saw from their trenches that a tremendous host was moving against their lines. 500 of the 1,000 remained, and as far as they could see, the German infantry was pressing on against them, column upon column, a grey world of men, 10,000 of them, as it appeared afterwards. Oh, there was no hope at all. They shook hands, some of them. One man improvised a new version of the battle song, "Goodbye, goodbye to Tipperary," ending with, "And we shan't get there." And they all went on firing steadily. The officer pointed out that such an opportunity for high-class fancy shooting might never occur again. The Tipperary humorist asked, "What price Sydney Street?" And the few machine guns did their best, but everybody knew it was of no use. The dead grey bodies lay in companies and battalions, as others came on and on and on, and they swarmed and stirred and advanced from beyond and beyond. "World without end, amen," said one of the British soldiers with some irrelevance as he took aim and fired. And then he remembered. He says he cannot think why or wherefore. A queer vegetarian restaurant in London, where he had once or twice eaten eccentric dishes of cutlets made of lentils and nuts that pretended to be steak. On all the plates in this restaurant there was printed a figure of St. George in blue, with the motto, "Adsit Anglis Sanctus Georgius." May St. George be a present help to the English. This soldier happened to know Latin and other useless things, and now, as he fired at his man in the grey advancing mass, 300 yards away, he uttered the pious vegetarian motto. He went on firing to the end, and at last Bill on his right had to clout him cheerfully over the head to make him stop. pointing out as he did so that the king's ammunition cost money and was not likely to be wasted in drilling funny patterns into dead Germans. For, as the Latin scholar uttered his invocation, he felt something between a shudder and an electric shock pass through his body. The roar of the battle died down in his ears to a gentle murmur. Instead of it, he says, he heard a great voice in a shout louder than a thunder peal, crying, "Hooray! Hooray! Hooray!" His heart grew hot as a burning coal. It grew cold as ice within him, as it seemed to him that a tumult of voices answered to his summons. He heard, or seemed to hear, thousands shouting, "St. George! St. George! Ha, Messiah! Ha, sweet saint! Grant us good deliverance! St. George for merry England! Harrow, harrow, Monsignor St. George! Succour us! Ha, St. George! Ha, St. George! A long bow and a strong bow! Heaven's knight, aid us!" And as the soldier heard these voices, he saw before him, beyond the trench, a long line of shapes with a shining about them. They were like men who drew the bow, and, with another shout, their cloud of arrows flew, singing and tingling through the air towards the German hosts. The other men in the trench were firing all the while. They had no hope, but they aimed just as they had been shooting at Bisley. Suddenly one of them lifted up his voice in the plainest English. "God help us!" he bellowed to the man next to him. "But we're blooming marvels! Look at those grey gentlemen! Look at them! Do you see them? They're not going down in dozens nor in hundreds. It's thousands it is. Look, look, there's a regiment gone while I'm talking to you." "Shut it!" the other soldier bellowed, taking aim. "What are you gassing about?" But he gulped with astonishment even as he spoke, for, indeed, the grey men were falling by the thousands. The English could hear the guttural scream of the German officers, the crackle of their revolvers as they shot the reluctant, and still, line after line crashed to the earth. All the while, the Latin-bred soldier heard the cry, "Harrow, harrow, Monsignor, dear saint, quick to our aid! St. George, help us! High Chevalier, defend us!" The singing arrows fled so swift and thick that they darkened the air. The heathen horde melted from before them. "More machine guns!" Bill yelled to Tom. "Don't hear them," Tom yelled back. "But thank God anyway, they've got it in the neck." In fact, there were 10,000 dead German soldiers left before that salient of the English army, and consequently there was no Sedan. In Germany, a country ruled by scientific principles, the great general staff decided that the contemptible English must have employed shells containing an unknown gas of a poisonous nature, as no wounds were discernible on the bodies of the dead German soldiers. But the man who knew what nuts tasted like when they called themselves steak knew also that St. George had brought his Agincourt Bowmen to help the English. There was some sort of confused complaint during last August of the ill behaviour of the children at certain Welsh watering places. Such reports and vague rumours are most difficult to trace to their heads and fountains. None has better reason to know that than myself. I need not go over the old ground here, but I am afraid that many people are wishing by this time that they had never heard my name. Again, a considerable number of estimable persons are concerning themselves gloomily enough, from my point of view, with my everlasting welfare. They write me letters, some in kindly remonstrance, begging me not to deprive poor sick-hearted souls of what little comfort they possess amidst their sorrows. Others send me tracts and pink leaflets with allusions to the daughter of a well-known canon. Others again are violently and anonymously abusive. And then, in open print, in fair book form, Mr. Begbie has dealt with me, righteously, but harshly, as I cannot but think. Yet it was all so entirely innocent, nay, casual on my part. A poor linnet of prose, I did but perform my indifferent piping in the evening news because I wanted to do so, because I felt that the story of the Bowmen ought to be told. An inventor of fantasies is a poor creature, heaven knows, when all the world is at war, but I thought that no harm would be done, at any rate, if I bore witness, after the fashion of the fantastic craft, to my belief in the heroic glory of the English host who went back from Mons, fighting and triumphing. And then, somehow or other, it was as if I had touched a button and set in action a terrific, complicated mechanism of rumours that pretended to be sworn truth, of gossips that posed as evidence, of wild taradiddles that good men most firmly believed. The supposed testimony of that daughter of a well-known canon took parish magazines by storm, and equally enjoyed the faith of dissenting divines. The daughter denied all knowledge of the matter, but people still quoted her supposed sure word, and the issues were confused with tales, probably true, of painful hallucinations and deliriums of our retreating soldiers, men fatigued and shattered to the very verge of death. It all became worse than the Russian myths, and as in the fable of the Russians, it seemed impossible to follow the streams of delusion to their fountainhead, or heads. Who was it who said that Miss M knew 2 officers who, etc., etc.? I suppose we shall never know his lying, deluding name. And so, I dare say, it will be with this strange affair of the troublesome children of the Welsh seaside town, or rather of a group of small towns and villages lying within a certain section or zone, which I am not going to indicate more precisely than I can help, since I love that country, and my recent experiences with the Bowmen have taught me that no tale is too idle to be believed. And of course, to begin with, nobody knew how this odd and malicious piece of gossip originated. So far as I know, it was more akin to the Russian myth than to the tale of the Angels of Mons. That is, rumour preceded print. The thing was talked of here and there and passed from letter to letter long before the papers were aware of its existence. And here it resembles rather the Mons affair. London and Manchester, Leeds and Birmingham were muttering vague, unpleasant things, while the little villages concerned basked innocently in the sunshine of an unusual prosperity. In this last circumstance, some believe, is to be sought the root of the whole matter. It is well known that certain East Coast towns suffered from the dread of air raids, and that a good many of their usual visitors went westward for the first time. So there is a theory that the East Coast was mean enough to circulate reports against the West Coast, out of pure malice and envy. It may be so, I do not pretend to know. But here is a personal experience, such as it is, which illustrates the way in which the rumour was circulated. I was lunching one day at my Fleet Street tavern. This was early in July, and a friend of mine, a solicitor of Sergeant's Inn, came in and sat at the same table. We began to talk of holidays, and my friend Edis asked me where I was going. "To the same old place," I said. "Manafon. You know we always go there." "Are you really?" said the lawyer. "I thought that coast had gone off a lot. My wife has a friend who's heard that it's not at all as it was." I was astonished to hear this, not seeing how a little village like Manafon could have gone off. I had known it for 10 years as having accommodation for about 20 visitors, and I could not believe that rows of lodging houses had sprung up since the August of 1914. Still I put the question to Edis. "Trippers?" I asked, knowing firstly that trippers hate the solitudes of the country and the sea. Secondly, that there are no industrial towns within cheap and easy distance. And thirdly, that the railways were issuing no excursion tickets during the war. "No, not exactly trippers," the lawyer replied. "My wife's friend knows a clergyman who says that the beach at Tremaine is not at all pleasant now. And Tremaine's only a few miles from Manafan, isn't it?" "In what way not pleasant?" I carried on my examination. Pierrots and shows and that sort of thing. I felt that it could not be so, for the solemn rocks of Tremaine would have turned the liveliest Pierrot to stone. He would have frozen into a crag on the beach, and the seagulls would carry away his song and make it a lament by lonely booming caverns that look on Avalon. Edis said he had heard nothing about showmen, but he understood that since the war, the children of the whole district had got quite out of hand. "Bad language, you know," he said, "all that sort of thing, worse than London slum children. One doesn't want one's wife and children to hear foul talk at any time, much less on their holiday. And they say that Castell Coch is quite impossible. No decent woman would be seen there." I said, "Really, that's a great pity," and changed the subject. But I could not make it out at all. I knew Castell Coch well, a little bay bastioned by the dunes of red sandstone cliffs, rich with greenery. A stream of cold water runs down there to the sea. There is a ruined Norman castle, the ancient church, and the scattered village. It is altogether a place of peace and quiet and great beauty. The people there, children and grown-ups alike, were not merely decent, but courteous folk. If one thanked a child for opening a gate, there would come the inevitable response, "And welcome kindly, sir." I could not make it out at all. I didn't believe the lawyer's tales. For the life of me I could not see what he could be driving at. And, for the avoidance of all unnecessary mystery, I may as well say that my wife and child and myself went down to Manafan last August and had a most delightful holiday. At the time we were certainly conscious of no annoyance or unpleasantness of any kind. Afterwards, I confess, I heard a story that puzzled and still puzzles me. And this story, if it be received, might give its own interpretation to one or two circumstances which seemed in themselves quite insignificant. But all through July I came upon traces of evil rumours affecting this most gracious corner of the earth. Some of the rumours were repetitions of Edis's gossip. Others amplified his vague story and made it more definite. Of course, no first-hand evidence was available. There never is any first-hand evidence in these cases. But A knew B, who had heard from C, that her second cousin's little girl had been set upon and beaten by a pack of young Welsh savages. Then people quoted a doctor in a large practice in a well-known town in the Midlands, to the effect that Tremaine was a sink of juvenile depravity. They said that a responsible medical man's evidence was final and convincing, but they didn't bother to find out who the doctor was, or whether there was any doctor at all, or any doctor relevant to the issue. Then the thing began to get into the papers, in a sort of oblique, by-the-way sort of manner. People cited the case of these imaginary bad children in support of their educational views. One side said that these unfortunate little ones would have been quite well behaved if they had had no education at all. The opposition declared that continuation schools would speedily reform them and make them into admirable citizens. Then the poor Arthurshire children seemed to become involved in quarrels about Welsh disestablishment, and in the question of the miners. and all the while they were going about behaving politely and admirably, as they always do behave. I knew all the time that it was all nonsense, but I couldn't quite understand in the least what it meant, or who was pulling the wires of rumour, or their purpose in so pulling. I began to wonder whether the pressure and anxiety and suspense of a terrible war had unhinged the public mind, so that it was ready to believe any fable, to debate the reasons for happenings which had never happened. At last, quite incredible things began to be whispered. Visitors' children had not only been beaten, they had been tortured. A little boy had been found impaled on a stake in a lonely field near Manafan. Another child had been lured to destruction over the cliffs at Castell Coch. A London paper sent a good man down quietly to Aachen to investigate. He was away for a week, and at the end of that period returned to his office and, in his own phrase, threw the whole story down. There was not a word of truth, he said, in any of these rumours. No vestige of a foundation for the mildest forms of all this gossip. He had never seen such a beautiful country. He had never met pleasant men, women, or children. There was not a single case of anyone having been annoyed or troubled in any sort or fashion. Yet all the while the story grew, and grew more monstrous and incredible. I was too much occupied in watching the progress of my own mythological monster to pay much attention. The town clerk of Tremaine, to which the legend had at length penetrated, wrote a brief letter to the press, indignantly denying that there was the slightest foundation for the unsavoury rumours which he understood were being circulated. And about this time we went down to Manafan and, as I say, enjoyed ourselves extremely. The weather was perfect. Blues of paradise in the skies, the seas all a shimmering wonder, olive greens and emeralds, rich purples, glassy sapphires changing by the rocks. Far away a haze of magic lights and colours, the meeting of sea and sky. Work and anxiety had harried me. I found nothing better than to rest on the thymy banks by the shore, finding an infinite balm and refreshment in the great sea before me, in the tiny flowers beside me. Or we would rest all the summer afternoon on a shelf, high on the grey cliffs, and watch the tide, creaming and surging about the rocks, and listen to it booming in the hollows and caverns below. Afterwards, as I said, there were one or two things that struck cold. But at the time, those were nothing. You see, a man in an odd white hat passed by. Think little or nothing about it. Afterwards, when you hear that a man wearing just such a hat had committed murder in the next street 5 minutes before, then you find in that hat a certain interest and significance. Funny children was the phrase my little boy used, and I began to think they were funny indeed. If there be a key at all to this queer business, I think it is to be found in a talk I had not long ago with a friend of mine named Morgan. He is a Welshman and a dreamer, and some people say he is like a child who has grown up and yet has not grown up like other children of men. Though I did not know it, while I was at Manafan, he was spending his holiday time at Castell Coch. He was a lonely man, and he liked lonely places, and when we met in the autumn, he told me how, day after day, he would carry his bread and cheese and beer in a basket to a remote headland on that coast known as the Old Camp. Here, far above the waters, are solemn, age-old walls, turf-grown, circumvallations rounded and smooth with the passing of many thousand years. At one end of this most ancient place there is a tumulus, a tower of observation perhaps, and underneath it slinks the green deceiving ditch that seems to wind into the heart of the camp, but in reality rushes down to sheer rock and a precipice over the waters. Here came Morgan daily, as he said, to dream of Avalon, to purge himself from the fuming corruption of the streets. And so, as he told me, it was with singular horror that one afternoon, as he dozed and dreamed, and opened his eyes now and again to watch the miracle and magic of the sea, as he listened to the myriad murmurs of the waves, his meditation was broken by a sudden burst of horrible, raucous cries. And the cries of children, too, but children of the lowest type. Morgan says that the very tones made him shudder. They were to the ear what slime is to the touch. And then the words, every foulness, every filthy abomination of speech, blasphemies that struck like blows at that sky that sank down into the pure shining depths, defiling them. He was amazed. He peered over the green wall of the fort, and there, in the ditch, he saw a swarm of noisome children, horrible little stunted creatures, with old men's faces, with bloated faces, with little sunken eyes, with leering eyes. It was worse than uncovering a brood of snakes or a nest of worms. No, he would not describe what they were about. Read about Belgium, said Morgan, and think they couldn't have been more than 5 or 6 years old. There was no infamy, he said, that they did not perpetrate. They spared no horror of cruelty. I saw blood running in streams as they shrieked with laughter, but I could not find the mark of it on the grass afterwards. Morgan said he watched them and could not utter a word. It was as if a hand held his mouth tight. But at last he found his voice and shrieked at them, and they burst into a yell of obscene laughter, and shrieked back at him, and scattered out of sight. He could not trace them. He supposes that they hid in the deep bracken behind the old camp. Sometimes I can't understand my landlord at Castell Coch, Morgan went on. He's the village postmaster, and has a little farm of his own, a decent, pleasant, ordinary sort of chap. But now and again he will talk oddly. I was telling him about these beastly children, and wondering who they could be, when he broke into Welsh. Something like, the battle that is for age unto ages, and the people take delight in it. So far, Morgan, and it was evident that he did not understand at all. But this strange tale of his brought back an odd circumstance or two that I recollected. A matter of our little boy, straying away more than once, and getting lost among the sand dunes, and coming back screaming, evidently frightened horribly, and babbling about funny children. Oh, we took no notice, did not trouble, I think, to look whether there were any children wandering about the dunes or not. We were accustomed to his small imaginations. But after hearing Morgan's story, I was interested, and I wrote an account of the matter to my friend, old Dr. de Troyes of Hereford, and they were only visible, only audible to children, and childlike. Hence the explanation of what puzzled you at first. The rumours. How did they arise? They arose from nursery gossip, from scraps and odds and ends of half-articulate children's talk, of horrors that they didn't understand, of words that shamed their nurses and their mothers. These little people of the earth rise up and rejoice in these times of ours. For they are glad, as the Welshman said, when they know that men follow their walks. Today's stories were The Bowmen and Out of the Earth by Arthur Machen. They were read by Jasper L'Estrange. I do hope you enjoyed them, and until next time, sweet dreams.